So what I would ask is that, look, even when you use this term systemic racism, this is something that I hear from left-wing friends of mine all the time as like a buzzword that's kind of like a get out of argument free, like they can't really deal with your point, so they just say systemic racism. It's all So what would you say is, in America in 2020, an example of systemic racism?
So the history, and you can't answer that without going through the history of systemic racism and how we got here. So if you look at the history of when, and this actually predates the formation of the United States of America, even during the colonial times, as an increasing number. So you had, especially in the South, in the antebellum period, and even before that, you had the most of the population, and I live in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which was one of the epicenters of slavery back during that era, even in the early and mid 18th century. You had essentially most of the population was white landowners who owned slaves. Over time, you started having mostly Scots-Irish, but from other countries as well. You had white migrants coming to the South and to other areas, and they were essentially, they came in and realized that this system wasn't for them, that they were incredibly powerful, well-heeled political cronies who owned government. Surprise, surprise, nothing changes there. And they were owning an entire race of people, and therefore they didn't really have to hire anyone, and they had a closed market, and there was no real way for the vast majority of white people who were there, who had no power or wealth, to be able to get ahead. And so in order to be able to maintain their power, they came up with ideas like white supremacy. Now, when we hear white supremacy now, we hear it as a bad thing, this idea that white people are superior and everything else. Back then, they sold it as settled science, and they used some very out of context biblical quotes to try to claim that people of color were the descendants of Cain, and that this was their, the iniquities of the father, and that's why they were having to live this way, and that they weren't even really at the same level of humanity as white people. And they created all this science like eugenics and all this nonsense, stuff that we all know is nonsense now, but they sold it as science. And what this did was it allowed people who had no power to feel as though they were at least better, they were superior, and it actually allowed them to then fight for a system that was inherently designed against them, almost as much as it was designed against people of color during that time. And so that is the basis of so the entire system of bringing an entire race over, stealing their labor for hundreds of years, then freeing them, but telling them they had to stay on the property that they owned, not letting them participate in the land giveaways that were happening in the Midwest, Jim Crow era, the gun control laws that didn't allow them to protect themselves against the Klan and government, so that every time communities of color did actually try to build themselves up, they were not able to get ahead. The so-called civil rights era, where they were allowed to vote, but also were herded into ghettos in the cities, while white families were given FHA housing and subsidized suburban housing, and black people were herded into ghettos and slums and not allowed to actually participate in the FHA program, all the way to the war on drugs, which was disproportionately used against them. We have a series of actions that have been taken that have led to a continued disproportionate use of force against communities of color. And also the constant barrage at the cultural level of telling black people that they are less than, which leads to, even to this day, where black people are also somewhat likely to have systemic bias or inherent bias, or what they call inherent bias when they do these studies and ask them how they associate people of different colors. Black people are somewhat more likely to actually associate black people with negative things as well. And it's because of what they call internalized racism, which is something that, after multiple generations of being told white equals good, white is the standard of good, black is the standard of bad, that actually works its way into at the cultural level. This is what we're talking about by systemic racism. Ending things like the war on drugs, the militarized police state, gun control, which is disproportionately used against communities of color every bit as much as the war on drugs is. Ending these things is a powerful first step towards ending the harm that is happening to all of us, but is especially happening to communities of color.